Right. So, the Sauropodomorpha are a clade of approximately 230 genera of rather aberrant stem avians, which soon after their origination in the late Triassic radiated to fulfill a global distribution, a range over which they remained an important group of megaherbivores until the end of the Cretaceous. Now, the most remarkable aspect of the Sauropodomorpha is infamously their extremely large size, with the clade containing the largest terrestrial animals ever known, massing in at around 80 tons plus, and with even average Sauropodomorph taxa weighing in at sort of over 10 tons. And quite how they achieved this unique gigantism is a sort of rather outstanding paleobiological question. And so the work I've been doing for my PhD has been looking at taking the functional perspective of the feeding apparatus of these animals, investigate its role in this evolution of gigantic body sizes, and I'm presenting some of the results from that today. So, despite its relatively small size, the craniodental systems of Sauropodomorphs are actually highly disparate, in a manner which can probably be most easily summarised as pertaining to 3 or 4 sort of functional grades. So, basically branching prosauropod grade taxa here, as exemplified by Plateosaurus, are generally held to have remained relatively morphologically and presumably functionally conservative, and to have been like relatively unspecialised herbivores or omnivores. However, through more derived notes here, we see the acquisition of a variety of characters hypothesized to have resulted in greater cranial robusticity, bite force, and processing power, coalescing with the onset of tooth-to-tooth occlusion at the base of the sauropoda in what's termed the broad-crowned functional grade after their tooth morphology. And this hypothesized functional shift has also been correlated with a reported ecological shift towards obligate herbivory and bulk feeding on coarse matter. And interestingly, this has also been invoked in schemes of body mass evolution, because this sort of coincides with the first time we see taxa of over 10 tons or so, after which such high masses become common, and systems of reported correlated progression and other evolutionary models linking these feeding characters and body mass are often invoked. Then within the sauropoda, craniodental morphology remains highly disparate, interestingly with 2 separate lineages, the Diplodocus and the Titanosaurs, acquiring a sort of very morphologically similar, at least, makeup of a highly abbreviated tooth row, a reduced and inclined adductor chamber, and a more gracile skull, potentially correlated with a more specialised foraging strategy. However, a sort of quantitative approach to much of this is, for the most part, lacking. So I decided to use a sort of combination of biomechanical and comparative phylogenetic techniques to address the following hypotheses. First, that these morphological grades do indeed also represent distinct and consistent functional grades. Second, that we do see a strong shift at the base of the sauropoda, consistent with this purported shift to bulk feeding with greater cranial robusticity and bite forces. Third, then, that these Diplodocus and Titanosaurs show the convergent evolution of similar functional aspects of the skull as well as morphological aspects. And then also to look as well as to whether we see whether these different grades are correlated with any differences in the evolutionary rate of biomechanical characters of the skull. And also to compare that then to see if to see whether there's any constant shifts in the rate of body mass evolution, so these two might be tightly correlated in some manner. So to do this, I measured 29 characters, 20 continuous, 9 binary, of biomechanical consequence from the skulls and jaws and teeth of 67 sauropodomorph taxa. These included measures such as mechanical advantage, which is a measure of jaw efficiency, which is commonly observed to increase in herbivorous lineages. Characters describing the extent, volume, and line of action of the adductor musculature, the robusticity of the skull and mandible, and then characters referring to the extent, complexity, and occlusional relationships of the tooth row, and then also characters of known functional consequence, which are commonly observed to be convergently acquired by herbivorous lineages as well. I subjected these characters to principal coordinate analysis to yield a multivariate function space, and the character loadings of each axis were calculated. Here we'll focus on PC axes 1 and 2 for the sake of brevity in this talk. And so the first thing to do here is to see if our different morphological grades do indeed are indeed functionally distinct, and we can see that yes, they are significantly distinct from each other, with basal prosauropod taxa here associated with relatively grey cell skulls and lower bite forces, with the basal broad-crowned sauropods here clustering relatively tightly in a region of function space correlated with more robust skulls and greater relative bite forces, and the narrow-crowned taxa coming out here. What's also immediately apparent from this is, contrary perhaps to what has been expected for morphological analysis, that basal taxa are actually highly disparate, and if we compare them, they show comparable levels of disparity to the rest of Sauropoda as a whole. And what this also means is that if we take a look at levels of disparity through time, although, as you'll no doubt be able to tell from the size of these confidence intervals, the patchy nature of the Sauropodomorph fossil record makes this somewhat what means we have to interpret this with some caution. We can also see that the high levels of disparity were actually acquired relatively early, potentially it's potentially suggesting that niches were filled quite early in Sauropodomorph evolution. So this great disparity that we observe within these prosauropod taxa is in characters which suggest this may be the result of variants along the omnivorous spectrum. So to investigate this in more detail, I took an n-member representative of each of these grades. So Platysaurus here, Camarasaurus up here, and Diplodocus here, and from CT scan data of specimens produced osteological reconstructions with retrodeformation and restoration of missing or damaged elements. This then allows us to produce volumetric reconstructions of the jaw musculature and calculations then of forces and bite forces, which ultimately can serve as boundary conditions for finite element models. And so to elaborate, we perform out on these three specimens of Platysaurus, Camarasaurus, and Diplodocus. Produce osteological reconstructions and muscle reconstructions. So we can see here that, as anticipated, the broad-crowned Camarasaurus exerted much greater bite forces than either Platysaurus or Diplodocus, which are actually sort of quite similar. And then if we look at finite element contour plots, with this being our von Mises stress, so hotter colours often refer to higher stresses, and these are simulating a static anterior bite with correction for differences in size. We can see that both the sauropod taxa here show significantly lower levels of stress than the Platysaurus, as the basal form we're comparing them to. And then also, there's a bit more subtle between Camarasaurus and Diplodocus. We can see significant lower stresses in the cranium of Camarasaurus. So that was So that's sort of quite interesting. It's quite interesting, and it sort of reinforces the conclusions that we drew from the multivariate work. But to take a phylogenetic perspective of this, I projected a informal supertree onto the first two PC axes to look for any sort of prominent shifts we might observe. And what we can see first of all here is that at the base of the sauropoda here, we can see a strong shift here towards region of function space correlated with greater cranial robusticity and higher relative bite forces, consistent with this scheme of a shift towards bulk feeding. If we then look within the Neosauropoda, we can see that evolution becomes somewhat more complex, with both the Titanosauriforms and Diplodocoids showing convergent trajectories towards overlapping regions of function space, but also with Euholopus here showing convergence back with sort of broad-crowned taxa. However, so I wanted to try to look at this convergence in particular in more detail to see whether it's a result of actual sort of convergent evolution towards similar sort of foraging style, potentially, or whether it's simply the result of random drift. So to do that, I took sort of 100 dated and formed super trees and subjected them to model fitting in our package of surface, which essentially fits a model of stabilizing selection, allowing for shifts in the local optimum, which might then represent shifts to a new adaptive peak, for example. So you can see here these large circles, for example, projecting the first two PC axes again, are local optima, with the colours of the taxa around them referring to those which occupy that particular regime. And so if we compare them across our trees, in sort of 100% of our trees, we see shifts at the base of sauropoda forms and sauropoda, and then also in the Diplodocoidea. But then in sort of around 80% of trees, we also see a convergent shift within the Titanosauria to the same regime as the Diplodocaudia, so potentially the same adaptive peak, with the exception of the Diplodocidae, which then sort of do their own thing, as it were, sort of out here as compared to the other Diplodocans and Titanosaurs, which are all sort of found in this region here. Again, suggesting that we do see genuine convergence between the Titanosaurs and these Diplodocoids. Then finally, I just wanted to look to see whether whether the different grades that we've got here are associated with different rates of evolution of these craniodental biomechanical characters. So essentially testing sort of in each case comparing a two-rate model of a priori assuming different rates within each of these grades of the background rate, and comparing the performance to a sort of null single-rate model within the Titanosaurs, Diplodocoids, and Sauropoda as compared to more basal taxa, and then also looking for any rate shift concentrated at the base of the Sauropoda, where we see this strong shift towards increased robusticity. And if we look at look at it, we can see that just as in proportion of trees which they seem to be they're more likely than a sort of null single rate model. You can see that evidence for any sort of significant shifts is very weak. Although in the abstract I say something about the Diplodocoids, that turned out to be a result of sort of patchy sampling, and once I dated it better, then evidence that became much weaker. And if we just compare that with body mass as well, with body masses mostly taken from a very comprehensive data set of Benson et al., we can see again evidence for shifts in body mass evolution corresponding with these sort of big functional shifts is even weaker. So to tie up these conclusions, we can see that the three Sauropoda morphologically grades are functionally as well as morphologically distinct, with basally branching taxa showing relatively gracile skulls and lower relative bite forces. Whereas then basal, then the broad crown sauropod showing relatively seem to be relatively specialised towards the exertion and accommodation of higher bite forces, and then with Diplodocoids and Titanosaurs each moving into overlapping regions of the function space. And that this high disparity in basally branching forms is in characters which potentially suggest variation on the omnivorous spectrum before we have the shift to obligate herbivory at the base of the Sauropoda. And as I said, this shift at the base of the Sauropoda is consistent with the postulated shift towards bulk feeding and obligate herbivory. And then we do see functional convergence as well as morphological convergence between Titanosaurs, Dicraeosaurs, and Rabachosaurids, although Diplodocids themselves are a bit more aberrant. And that these functional shifts aren't, however, correlated with any shifts in rate of evolution of these functional characters, skull, mandible, or body mass. So it just leaves me to thank everybody who's helped me in various ways, and my funders, and then also, of course, to thank all you for listening.